Hello, welcome to episode 6 of the Young Justice Podcast. This is Zach Rhoads. Today, my guest is the incredibly insightful Peter Singer. Peter Singer is the professor of bioethics at Princeton University, and he's a laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. He's also the author of at least 15 books that I know of. I guess there are probably more than that. His newest is one that I highly recommend, called Ethics in the Real World, which is a smooth read comprised of 82 short essays about ethics and how they apply to everyday life. He talked about this book recently with Sam Harris on the Waking Up podcast, so I'm going to send you to a link of that also when this is done. Peter Singer has been a great influence on the way that I make moral decisions. Many listeners know that I'm a vegetarian, and that my wife and I have made a pledge to donate certain amounts of money to effective charities each year. This is heavily influenced by Singer and his teachings. So today, Singer makes his case for moral responsibility in terms of helping other humans in the world. And then we get into his idea about the way we ought to treat animals as well, apropos his classic book, Animal Liberation. What we didn't get into, just because of the time restraint, were strategies for encouraging rational and ethical thinking with children, which of course this podcast really is all about children and how we raise them and treat them. So to make up for the lack of time, I've done two things. Under the link to this podcast on my website, zachrhoadsconsulting.com, I provided links to some of Singer's work and resources, including a concept I recommend checking out, adopted by a lot of schools in the world and even in this local area of Vermont, called The Giving Game. So you can follow those links to find out more about ethics, how one might teach it, and also in the next week or two, I'll publish an article on my website, and it'll have a list of tips for raising kids to think rationally about ethics. I'm also overdue, I should say, to publish an article about my conversation with Stanton Peele about addiction, so you can look forward to reading both of those soon. Until then, here is my conversation with one of the most influential thinkers on the globe, Peter Singer. So I have on the line the legendary Professor Peter Singer. Professor Singer, it's an honor, and thank you for speaking with me today.
I'm happy to be talking to you, Zach.
At this point in the podcast, I think my listeners will have heard a pretty clear introduction about you and your work in ethics and bioethics, and I hope to relate your ideas to my work in child development. So there are a couple topics I hope we're going to get into, talking to you about animal ethics, his one definite priority. I'd actually like to start by getting people familiar with your argument for effective altruism and our responsibility to limit global poverty. And because I think it's just such a useful foundation, at least for me, I'm wondering if you'll describe your famous shallow pond analogy.
Yeah, sure. This goes back quite a long way. In fact, one of the first articles that I wrote was about whether we living in affluent countries have moral obligations to help people in great need. I wrote this at the time of a crisis in what was then East Pakistan, but is now Bangladesh, when there were 9 million people who were refugees who'd flooded into India to escape the repression of the Pakistani army. And I was living in England at the time, and although there were some appeals for people to help the refugees, there was very little that was actually going to them. And that raised a question in my mind as to, well, is it okay for us to just go on living our comfortable lives while other people are in danger of starving or dying from lack of proper sanitation and shelter? And it occurred to me that the situation could perhaps be represented in a more familiar example closer to home. That is of the need to rescue a small child who had fallen into a pond and was in danger of drowning. And so I asked readers to imagine that they were walking across a park, that there was a pond in the park, that they knew that the pond was a shallow one that they could wade into without no risk to themselves, but that they noticed that a small child had fallen into the pond and the child was too small to wade out of the pond. And so, of course, the first thing you would do is you would expect that somebody else would be around looking after the child and that they would jump into the pond and rescue the child. But imagine that you can't see anyone there. You don't understand how this small child got away from whoever was looking after him or her, but that's what happened. So the next thing you think about is, well, I better rush in and save the child. But then you realize that you're on your way to a very important occasion and you've put on your very best and most expensive shoes and other clothes, and they're going to get ruined if you jump into the muddy pond. And of course, there'll be some inconvenience. You'll have to go home, get changed, you'll be wet, you might be late for what you're planning. Still, would those be reasons why you could just walk on past the child and leave the child to drown? And I think everyone really would say no. They are not sufficient reasons. The fact that you'll be up for some expense in replacing your clothes, that there'll be some inconvenience to you, those are not anything comparable to the life of a child. And so, of course, you should be prepared to sacrifice those things to save the life of this child, even though you're not responsible for the child's situation, even though the child is not your child. You have no special obligations to that child because of the child being placed in your care or anything like that. So if people agree with that, then they've in fact agreed that we do have responsibilities to strangers. We do have an obligation to help them if we can do so at a minor sacrifice to ourselves, a sacrifice that's not in any way comparable to what the child would lose. I then asked people to think about if you agree that it would be wrong, not just not very nice, but actually wrong to walk past the child and leave the child to drown, then what can you say about our conduct if we know that we can save the lives of children in developing countries? We know that we can do that at a not very significant cost to us, something that won't be greatly more expensive than replacing the clothes in the example. And yet we do nothing about it. Isn't that also then wrong? And I think it is. I consider various possible disanalogies, of course. No analogy is perfect, and there are some disanalogies between the child in the pond and our situation regarding people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world. But I think on further reflection, none of these disanalogies really show that we don't have obligations to help children who are in danger of starving or dying from other causes, preventable causes, in countries much poorer than our own.
Well, in the interest of time, we can forget people who will say they have no obligation to save the child. And I don't need to get into too much detail, but maybe what do you think are the most serious objections to your idea about the drowning child example, and how would you respond to those?
Most of the objections point to psychological differences between the situation, such as we can see the child in front of us. We know that it's this child. We have only one child to save. And in the case of global poverty, of course, we can't see the child. We don't have an identifiable child. And even after we've saved this child, there are more children or one child, there are more children that we should save. And I accept that those do make a psychological difference to how we feel about the two situations. But that, I think, is the result of a kind of evolutionary inheritance from having lived in small face-to-face societies where we evolved an immediate response to people in need whom we could see, but we didn't evolve any kind of response to people we can't see because we couldn't really even help them for most of human existence. And I don't think that that's really very relevant morally. The other major objection that often comes up is a factual one. Can I know that my donation, if I donate to a non-government organization that's helping children in developing countries, can I really know that my money will do what I want it to do? Can I know that it won't also be swallowed up in the bureaucracy of the organization? And I think that's a serious question, but it's it's one now that I think has a clear answer, because we have seen the development of independent research organizations, you might say auditing organizations, that examine charities, examine how they spend their money, and actually, in the case of the best of these organizations, look at studies in the field of the impact that they're having. So we can know with a very high degree of confidence now that if you donate to a charity recommended by, say, GiveWell, which people can find at givewell.org, or The Life You Can Save at thelifeyoucansave.org, those charities have been checked, and you can have a high degree of confidence that your donation will be very well used to save lives or help people generally improve the lives of people in developing countries. So I think that factual objection is one that can be met.
I think that's perfectly logically consistent. Thank you. I wonder, what is the extent of one's moral responsibility to give? So my wife and I give to charities through thelifeyoucansave.org, for example. But I think to be consistent with your argument, when you lay it out, we ought to be giving a lot more. Just how much should one give, and to whom should we be giving?
Well, I can't tell you how much you should be giving because I don't know how much you earn, and I don't know what responsibilities you have to your family and others close to you. But the lifeyoucansave.org does have a kind of a scale. If you look at it, if you go to the website, there are pages you can find about pledging to give and how much should I give. And I've suggested there a sliding scale, starting with quite small amounts for people on modest incomes, but increasing progressively for people who are earning a lot. But you could say, well, why exactly those amounts? In a sense, they're arbitrary, and some people on lower incomes may feel, hey, I could give more because the scale only says I should be giving, let's say, 5% of my income, and really I could give more. I could give 10%. So it's clearly good to do better. I'd say there's no kind of black and white line where you can say if you give less than this, you're a bad person, and if you give this much, you're a good person. It's a scale, a spectrum, where I think what we want to do is to start giving, give something significant, and then after doing that for some months or perhaps a year, reassess your giving and saying, well, was this really a sacrifice? Am I missing anything important? Isn't it more important to me that I'm helping others in need? And many people, I think, will feel, oh yeah, I could do more, and so they'll gradually build up. And I think that's probably the best way for people to approach it.
Well, thank you. There's a lot to cover on this, but so just in the interest of time, and I want to talk to you about animal welfare. I did want to talk actually about what we could do to instill a Peter Singer-like rational altruism in kids. But I like the idea of the giving game, for example, but we're short on time, so maybe under the link to our talk I can provide various articles and links to talks of yours and such, and maybe if you think that I should add more, you could email me.
That would be great. Yeah, there's certainly plenty of material online.
So to move into the sort of the next topic, and if I don't, some listeners are never going to forgive me. I've flirted for a long time with the idea of cutting meat out of my diet for ethical reasons, and I finally have for the past couple years. I think your work has to be the most influential in my decision to finally take that step, because you made it clear that we're all responsible for a share of the harms that we collectively cause. So I guess insofar as it's even possible to give an elevator explanation of this, could you sum up to an extent your case for why we should be vegetarian?
Yeah, there are two important reasons really now. When I originally became a vegetarian back in the 1970s, my reason was because of concern for the well-being of animals, and in particular, I suppose, because of discovering that the great majority of the animals raised and killed for food do not even have decent lives. I mean, we've always known that they were slaughtered for us, but perhaps we assumed that they had good lives on farms before that one bad day in their life when they were killed. But in fact, because most of them are raised on factory farms in very confined circumstances and very unnatural lives for the species that they are, most of them are having a miserable time for their entire life, which might be it's about 6 weeks in the case of chickens, and maybe 14 months in the case of cattle, and pigs in between. So it just seemed to me that that was wrong, that animals do matter, that they have lives of their own to live, and we should not be bringing them into existence in order to inflict pain and suffering on them when we don't need to do so, when we can live perfectly healthy lives, in fact, probably healthier lives, without eating animals. So that was the start of my thinking about the ethics of animals, and I think we have a kind of prejudice or bias against taking seriously the interests of beings who are not members of our species. I call that speciesism, and in some ways it's parallel to racism or sexism that we're more familiar with. The second reason that emerged more recently is, of course, climate change. And we now know that raising animals for food is a major contributor to climate change. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has said that the livestock sector is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transport sector. That is all the cars, planes, buses, ships, and so on in the world. And yet this is something that clearly is not necessary, that we could not take part in, that we could change our diet and, as I said, live healthy lives without eating animals. So that's a very powerful additional reason, I think, why we ought to be vegetarian.
Sadly, that'll probably resonate more with people than the former. But I should hasten to say I'm a vegetarian, so I eat animal products. I'm not a vegan, and in some respects, that's sort of just a symbolic gesture insofar as animals might still be suffering for me to get my cheese and eggs. But so what if I'm a vegetarian and only eat animal products from, say, free-range farms where I know for sure animals live decent lives? Would you say that's fully morally defensible, or do you think I'd have to go further before I can say I'm really hitting moral bedrock?
Well, I think we ought to separate perhaps the dairy and the eggs. I think if you can get eggs from hens who are really properly free range, able to move around outside and have good lives, even though those hens are going to get killed at a point when they are ceasing to lay enough eggs for the producer to keep them, you could at least say, they are getting good lives while they're alive. And that's, for some people that would be acceptable, that would be ethical. And in terms of greenhouse gases, chickens are not major producers of greenhouse gases. The dairy issue is a bit different for milk and cheese and so on, partly because cattle are major greenhouse gas producers. They're big producers of methane, which is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. And secondly, because ask yourself, why is a cow producing milk? Think about human women. They don't just randomly produce milk when they get mature. They only produce milk after they have a child. And cows are exactly the same. So to get milk from a cow, you have to make the cow pregnant, but then you have to take the calf away from the cow. Otherwise, the calf will drink all the milk, and you won't have milk to sell. So dairy cows are regularly made pregnant, roughly yearly, and their calves are taken away from them. And that obviously causes a lot of distress to the cow because cows are mammals. They care for their young. They have a strong bond with their young. And if their calf is taken away from them, obviously they miss them. Every honest dairy farmer will tell you that the cows will call for their calves for a long time after the calf is taken away. And then what happens to the calf? Well, the calf may be slaughtered for veal. The calf may be raised for hamburger beef. They're not the same as the sort of beef cattle varieties that we eat, so at best they'd make hamburger. But they're going to miss their mothers for a long time as well, and they're probably not going to have good lives either. So I'd say, if you can at least cut down your consumption of dairy products. There are good non-dairy milks available now that many people prefer anyway, and there are even some decent non-dairy cheeses available in supermarkets now. So if you can do that, I think that's better. But again, it's a gradual process. For many people, it's a matter of getting there step by step.
Sure. Well, thank you. Actually, that gave me a sort of an eye-widening perspective there. I'm going to go for moral gold. So my wife and I are planning to have children, and people ask us pretty often if we're going to want our children to be vegetarian. I really, honestly don't think I've spent enough time thinking about it. Do you think it is ethical to raise children on a vegan or vegetarian diet? Or maybe I should say, are there reasons it could be unethical to do so?
No, I don't think there's any reasons it could be unethical to raise children as vegans or vegetarians, as long as you are careful to inform yourself about their nutritional needs. I've raised my three children as vegetarians rather than vegans because that's what we were at the time. They're now in their late 30s and early 40s, so this is quite a while ago. But I think since then the evidence about raising them as vegans in a healthy way has strengthened, and it certainly can be done, but you do need to know what you're doing. You may need to fortify their diet with vitamin B12, for example, which is one product that you can't easily get from vegan foods. So I'd say be careful, and if you do want to give them some free-range eggs or something like that, you might well feel more comfortable doing that. And of course, if you can, or if your wife can feed them on breast milk for the early months, that's also clearly the best kind of milk that you can feed them on. So I think it's ethical, and there are plenty of families of, in fact, into third and fourth generation vegans now who are healthy and successful. So there's no reason why you can't do that.
Well, just one more thing on this topic. You're so well reasoned when you talk about animal ethics, and I like that you allow people to visualize sort of an ethical continuum with respect to treatment of sentient beings. We haven't talked about it here, but I've read articles in your book, Animal Liberation, whereas a human's capacities to suffer may be the greatest, and so to eat or kill a human would be extremely unethical, not to mention the yuck factor. And though still unethical, it would be slightly more ethically sound maybe to kill and eat a pig. And then we get down to animals with virtually no awareness, or, like you say, more rudimentary nervous systems like lobsters or maybe clams or oysters, where the ethical implications of killing and eating a lobster are far less. So for people who can't get behind just going all in, or going full vegetarian or vegan, I think they can still read your book, Animal Liberation, and hear what you have to say, and sort of use this ethical scale. And if people could just get that far, I think the world would be a more peaceful and fair place. So thank you for providing the blueprint for questioning our moral intuitions in this way.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I do think there's a matter of degrees in these things. Personally, I will give lobsters the benefit of the doubt. They're complex creatures, and we don't really know exactly what they feel. If you get to oysters and clams, I think it's probably more doubtful that they can feel very much because they can't move or run away from things. So, in evolutionary terms, it's not clear why they would have evolved a sort of capacity for consciousness.
Right.
Definitely, you don't need to eat these things. If you're the kind of person who lives in a place where there's a good range of plant-based foods in your supermarket, and you can easily enjoy a tasty and healthy cuisine without eating them, then I think it's better not to. But I'm also not saying that people ought to beat themselves up every time that they depart from these strict standards. I don't think that's a helpful attitude to life. I think we ought to think about, am I having a really substantial impact on supporting cruelty or supporting damage to the climate of our planet, and that's really what we ought to be focused on. And occasional trivial lapses are not really what the point of it all is about.
Again, so fair. Before I let you go, I do want to ask if we've indeed sparked people's interest. What kinds of publications or websites or what have you should people be checking out to learn more about effective giving, or animal welfare, or maybe just to get a better understanding of you and your work?
Well, on effective altruism and global poverty, we've already mentioned thelifeyoucansave.org. Certainly people could also just Google effective altruism and a lot of good websites will come up. You can certainly look at GiveWell for other recommendations of charities along with The Life You Can Save. On animal issues, there are many good organizations that you can look at that are having campaigns for it. There's Mercy for Animals, the Humane League. They're definitely good organizations. The Humane Society of the United States has a big program on farm animal welfare. So does People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. So there are plenty of good organizations there. If you're interested in my work, there's a website, petersinger.info, where you can find out a little bit more about me and what I'm doing, events that I speak at, things that I've been writing. And of course, there are, again, if you Google, you'll find a number of videos. There's a TED talk that I gave on effective altruism. I recommend looking at that if you want to know more about that. And if you want to read, my books on global poverty, The Life You Can Save, and The Most Good We Can Do. And on animals, Animal Liberation is still in print in a revised edition 40 years after it first came out. And I still stand by what I wrote in that book, so I'd be very happy for people to read that.
Brilliant. Peter Singer, I cannot imagine just how precious your time is, so I thank you for sharing some of the time with me today to help me spread reason.
Thanks for spreading the word, Jack. I appreciate it.
Okay. Hopefully we can connect again, but until then, good luck in all of your affairs, and thank you very much.